If you were a kid in Canada during the 1970s, this vintage CCM Mustang bicycle was your number one wish for Christmas. And if you grew up in Weston, Ontario, you almost certainly knew the people who made that wish come true. Today, that bicycle fetches hundreds of dollars at vintage markets and estate sales across the country. It is back in fashion, lovingly restored in garages from Vancouver to Halifax. But the same cannot be said for the place that built them, the great CCM factory. This is the tragic downfall of Canada's most iconic bicycle factory. If you stand on Weston Road in Toronto today, you will witness something unsettling. You are standing on land that was once the beating heart of Canadian manufacturing. This is where the floor once vibrated with the stamping of steel tubes. This is where the air hissed with blazing torches and the smell of hot enamel paint. This is where thousands of men and women came through the same gates every morning for decades, building something the entire country recognized. But today the grime has been scrubbed away. The kinetic energy has been surgically removed. In its place stand condominiums, parking lots, and the particular silence of a neighborhood that has forgotten what it used to be. To the casual observer, it looks like progress. But ask anyone who worked there, and they will not call this a transformation. They call it an erasure. Because one day this was a self-contained city that defined Canadian childhood. The next, it was a void filled by concrete and indifference. Only fragments remain. A few old photographs in the local library, a faded corporate logo on a building that has changed hands 3 times since the factory closed. The real CCM now exists only in the minds of the old guard, speaking a dead language of lugs and brazing rods that the new residents walking these streets will never understand. So the question that haunts the city is simple. How did an industrial giant that survived 2 world wars and defined Canadian culture simply vanish into thin air? To really get to the bottom of this, we need 3 things. A small shop on King Street, a group of bicycle mechanics who refused to quit, and a country that was desperate to believe it could build something the world wanted. It is 1899, a cramped workshop in the industrial heart of Toronto. The Canada Cycle and Motor Company is formed from the forced merger of 5 struggling bicycle manufacturers who have each separately concluded that they cannot survive the collapse of the great bicycle boom of the 1890s alone. The logic is brutal and simple. Combine or die. The new company controls factories, distribution networks, and brand names across Ontario. On paper, it is a powerhouse. In reality, it is 5 companies with 5 different cultures, 5 sets of machinery, and 5 sets of workers who do not particularly trust each other, shoved under one roof and told to build bicycles. But what saves CCM in its earliest years is not clever management, it is the bicycle itself. The safety bicycle has just transformed personal transportation across the industrialized world. In a country the size of Canada, where towns are separated by vast distances and horses are expensive, a machine that ordinary people can afford and maintain themselves is not a luxury. It is a revolution. CCM understands this earlier and more clearly than almost any competitor. They build for the Canadian reality. Tough frames for rough roads, simple mechanisms that a farmer can fix with basic tools, paint finishes that can survive a prairie winter. The bikes are not beautiful in the way that European machines are beautiful. They are built to endure. By 1902, CCM is producing tens of thousands of bicycles a year. By 1910, the name is on every street in every city in the country. Children grow up saving for a CCM the way their parents saved for a horse. The factory on Weston Road expands and then expands again. New buildings rise. New machinery arrives. The workforce grows from hundreds to thousands. But here is something I find genuinely remarkable about this story the deeper I look into it. While CCM is building bicycles, it is also quietly building something else entirely. Ice skates, hockey equipment. The CCM name that every Canadian associates with the bicycle is, by the 1920s, equally associated with the blades on the feet of every hockey player in the country. CCM becomes 2 empires simultaneously, one for summer and one for winter, and the combination of the 2 makes the company genuinely invincible for decades. No Canadian company before or since has so completely dominated 2 separate sporting categories at the same moment. To the people of Weston, CCM stops feeling like a business. It starts acting like a sovereign nation. By the 1940s, the factory employs thousands of workers from the surrounding neighborhoods. It has its own culture, its own rhythms, its own brutal social contract. The deal is simple. You give CCM your working life, and CCM gives you stability. A wage that covers the mortgage, a pension that covers the retirement, a community built around the factory gates. But the cost of admission is a sensory assault. Step onto the floor, and the noise does not just enter your ears. It occupies the entire space between your thoughts. The tube-cutting machines run without pause. The brazing stations glow orange in the dimness. The paint shop fumes drift through every corridor, regardless of what the ventilation system is supposed to do. Men who work the frame-straightening stations develop a particular sensitivity in their hands, an ability to feel a misalignment of a fraction of a millimeter through the palms alone that takes years to build and disappears almost immediately when they stop doing the work. It is knowledge that lives in the body and cannot be written down. And yet amidst the noise and the fumes, a civilization flourishes. Fathers bring sons to the factory floor. A mechanic who started at 17 is still there at 60, and his son started at 17 the year the mechanic turned 40. Does well, the neighborhood does well. The neighborhood is a part of the factory is a part of the neighborhood does well. The neighborhood does well. The corner stores stay open. The hockey league has sponsors. The church roof gets fixed. This is the seduction of the contract. You endure the factory floor so you can live the life that surrounds it. The golden era runs from roughly 1945 to 1965. Canada is growing. The suburbs are expanding. Every family that moves into a new bungalow on a new street in a new suburb has children who need bicycles. CCM supplies them. The post-war boom is exactly the market CCM was built for. Affordable, durable, Canadian. The order books are full. The factory runs at capacity. The workers have steady wages. For anyone standing in the Weston factory in 1955 looking at the production numbers, the future seems entirely secure. But here's something I find genuinely troubling. The deeper I dig into this story, while the workers on the floor are building bicycles with genuine pride and genuine skill, the people above them in the corporate structure are making a series of decisions that none of the workers know about and none of them would endorse if they did. The financial architecture of CCM is quietly rotting from the inside out, and nobody on the shop floor has any way of seeing it coming. You rarely see an empire fall to a single gunshot. Usually it is a slow, invisible rot. For CCM, the rot begins in the early 1960s when the company is absorbed into a larger conglomerate with interests spread across multiple industries. The bicycle and skate business that once had its own focus management, its own engineering team, its own direct relationship between product and profit, is now one line item in a diversified portfolio managed by people whose primary expertise is not bicycles. The engineers who dream in steel tubes and gear ratios are quietly replaced by accountants who dream in quarterly returns. Suddenly, the bicycle stops being a vessel of Canadian childhood. It becomes a unit of volume on a balance sheet. The new management looks at the complex hand-finished CCM frame with its carefully selected tubing and its precisely applied decals and asks a simple question. How do we make this cheaper? The answer is always the same. Simplify the specification, reduce the quality of the components, find a lower-cost supplier for the steel. The changes are individually small. Each one saves pennies per unit, but together they accumulate into something that a serious cyclist can feel the moment they pick up the bike. The responsiveness is different. The weight is wrong. Something that was once a precision object has become an adequate object. And adequate is not why people remember the name. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, something is happening that CCM's management is watching with the particular kind of attention that does not lead to action. Japanese manufacturers are entering the North American bicycle market. Not at the bottom, where cheap bikes have always existed, but at the middle, where CCM has lived comfortably for decades. The Japanese bikes are lighter, the components are more precisely made, the gear systems shift with a smoothness that CCM's aging Sturmey Archer equivalent simply cannot match. And crucially, they cost the same or less than a comparable CCM. CCM's response is something that I find genuinely astonishing the more closely I examine it. They do not respond. There is no emergency engineering program to develop better components. There is no serious attempt to understand what the Japanese are doing differently and match it. There is instead a faith, expressed in boardroom language as the strategic confidence, that Canadian consumers will remain loyal to a Canadian brand. The assumption is that the name CCM carries enough weight to compensate for an increasingly inferior product. It is not an unreasonable assumption, it is simply wrong. By the mid 1970s, the market share numbers are telling a story that nobody at CCM headquarters wants to read aloud. Japanese and Taiwanese imports are taking the middle market. CCM is being squeezed between cheap imports at the bottom and sophisticated European and Japanese performance bikes at the top. The factory at Weston Road, designed to produce 100,000 bicycles a year at a price point that no longer makes sense, is becoming a liability. Panic sets in slowly, then all at once. The executives realize that the comfortable assumption of brand loyalty is insufficient. They need something new. Something that captures the imagination of a generation that grew up watching television and wants products that feel like the future. The bicycle, in the mind of CCM's marketing department, needs to be reinvented. What follows is a series of product decisions that range from the genuinely innovative to the catastrophically misconceived. And the tragedy is that the company cannot always tell which is which. The BMX wave arrives in Canada in the late 1970s, imported from California on the feet of kids who have seen the bikes in films and on television. CCM sees the wave coming and tries to catch it. The resulting bikes are competent but not exciting. They are built to CCM's traditional standards of durability rather than to the performance specifications that the BMX culture actually demands. A child who wants a BMX wants a bike that feels like a weapon. CCM gives them a bike that feels like a reliable appliance. The distinction matters enormously to a 12-year-old and not at all to the accountant who signed off on the specification. Meanwhile, the mountain bike is being invented in California, with no reference to CCM whatsoever. The men building the first mountain bikes in Marin County are not thinking about Canadian manufacturing traditions, or the Weston Road factory, or CCM's decades of experience with durable frames. They're thinking about riding down fire roads as fast as possible on modified cruiser bikes, and they are building what they need from scratch. By the time CCM recognizes that the mountain bike is not a fad, but a fundamental shift in what bicycles are for, the American and Japanese manufacturers who moved first have established brand identities in the category that CCM cannot displace. CCM tries anyway. The mountain bikes that emerged from the Weston Road factory in the 1980s are technically adequate and commercially unsuccessful. The brand that once meant something specific and valuable in the mind of a Canadian consumer, that meant the bicycle your father rode and the skates that got you through winter, no longer translates into the new vocabulary of the sport. CCM is trying to fight a cultural war with industrial weapons, and the culture is not interested. The factory begins to shrink. Production lines that once ran 3 shifts are consolidated to 2, then to 1. Workers who expected to retire from CCM are instead handed redundancy notices with a particular corporate courtesy that somehow makes the whole thing worse. The community that built itself around the factory gates begins to fray. The corner stores lose customers. The hockey league loses sponsors. The church roof stays leaking. How does a century-old industrial institution finally die? You might think it requires a dramatic collapse, a single catastrophic decision, a villain walking in and switching off the lights. Instead, CCM fades in the way that most industrial empires fade. Not with a bang, but with a series of quarterly reports, each one slightly worse than the last, each one generating a management response that addresses the symptom rather than the disease, until the accumulated weight of inadequate responses becomes impossible to carry. The ownership of the CCM brand passes through multiple corporate hands across the 1980s and 1990s. Each new owner arrives with a plan to revitalize the brand. Each plan involves some combination of cost reduction, product innovation, and marketing investment. None of them address the fundamental problem, which is that CCM is trying to manufacture in Canada at Canadian labor costs while competing against products manufactured in Asia at Asian labor costs, and the gap between those two cost structures is not bridgeable by any amount of brand equity or manufacturing tradition. The factory at Weston Road closes in stages. First, the frame building operation moves offshore, then the assembly, then the warehousing. Each closure is announced with language about modernization and efficiency and the long-term health of the brand. The workers who hear these announcements understand them correctly, as the language of an institution explaining why it no longer needs them. The final production run at the Weston Road facility is not marked with ceremony. There is no commemorative last bicycle, no speech from the plant manager, no photograph for the local newspaper. The line simply stops, and the workers clock off and walk out of the gates, and most of them never walk back through those gates again. The factory that once employed thousands produces nothing. The machinery is sold or scrapped. The building sits empty for years before being redeveloped into something that has nothing to do with bicycles. If you perform a forensic autopsy on CCM, you do not find a single cause of death. You find multi-organ failure. First, there was the failure of investment. The factory at Weston Road was never adequately modernized for the competitive environment of the 1970s and 1980s. Second, there was the failure of product. Second, there was the failure of product vision. CCM's management consistently chose to defend the existing market position rather than define a new one. When the mountain bike arrived and redefined what a bicycle was for, CCM responded too slowly and too cautiously to matter. Third, there was the failure of the brand itself. The CCM name carried enormous weight with a generation that grew up with CCM bicycles and CCM skates. That generation aged. The generation that followed had no particular relationship with the name, and no reason to develop one. But in death, CCM is more valuable than it has been in decades. The vintage Mustang, the bike that cost $30 new and sat in garages across the country for 40 years, is now a collector's object. Restored examples command serious money at auction. Middle-aged Canadians are paying significant sums to buy back the childhood that their parents gave them on a Saturday morning in a suburban driveway. The bicycle, that was once the democratic transport of the Canadian family, has been transformed into a luxury totem of memory and nostalgia. The CCM brand itself still exists, attached to bicycles, manufactured overseas and sold through mass-market retailers. The name survives, the factory does not. The knowledge that built the factory, the accumulated skill of generations of workers who understood steel tubes and brazing rods and frame geometry at a level that cannot be learned from a manual, that knowledge is gone, dispersed, retired, dead. If you stand where the Weston Road factory used to be and close your eyes, you can almost reconstruct it. The percussion of the tube-cutting machines, the orange glow of the brazing stations, the particular weight of a finished frame lifted from the jig for the first time, still warm from the torch, the smell of enamel curing in the paint shop, the sound of thousands of bicycles being assembled simultaneously, a mechanical chorus that was the sound of a country building something it was proud of. Then open your eyes, condominiums, parking, silence. CCM did not just go bankrupt. A heartbeat that pumped life into Canadian manufacturing for nearly a century simply stopped. The morale of the story is the same in Weston as it is in Nottingham, in Birmingham, in every city that built something real and then watched the world decide it could be built more cheaply somewhere else. In the modern economy, to stand still is to die, and even the strongest steel will eventually rust if you leave it in the rain of complacency.